Today sessions will be the final sessions, and as I said yesterday, before ending that, although this is the end of the policy dialogue, but it is the beginning of the networking and co-working and working with you in the future through various platforms that AIT will organize with colleagues from UNEP's different departments. As you know that now we are working with UNEP on the economic department in Geneva. We are going to also working with the UNEPs on the Asia Pacific front, which is on the sustainable consumptions ongoing. And also we are going to work with the UNEPs on Sea Circular in very near future. So we are actually connecting for future, collaboration, brain knowledge collaboration, and also activity collaborations. And this interaction will be moving on non-stop until people from your side, from our side, be able to produce some meaningful at least resources to share with everybody. Last but not the least, at the end of the program, after all the speakers, I will also share with you a quick one. It looks like today we will not have any group discussions, but I will have a large group discussion to flip on the ideas that we generated in the past 4 days, not 4 days, 5 days, sorry, 3 days, those are the things that we digested together, and if anybody would like to add anything more, so we will keep that record for further dissemination to every one of you. To take note, it's a paper of 2 pages. It's not very long, it will be very short, but it's containing a key points and something that we can think about in the future. Without delay any further, because of we don't want to delay this because it's a Friday and you have to go home, you have to take a break, and also Friday in many countries now also holiday. So I would like to now to start the next speaker, which we are very honored that our next speaker is coming from UNEP, and our speaker will share with you on the subjects of the Global Alliance for Building and Constructions. May I welcome Nora Sterer from UNEP to share information and knowledge with the audience. Nora, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. It's my pleasure and my honor to be here with you today and to share with you some thoughts around the topic of buildings, which of course are a critical ingredient to sustainable infrastructure. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we can get started. I hope you can all see that. If at any point my connection is interrupted, please let me know. Okay, so I am speaking to you indeed, as the gentleman from AIT said, on behalf of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, the Global ABC, which is hosted by UNEP at the Economy Division in Paris, although I am coming to you right now from Amman in Jordan. So I am sure that you're all already convinced of the need for sustainable infrastructure and sustainable buildings, but we do like to start with the big why. Why is it important to focus on buildings? Just to highlight the magnitude that we are dealing with in terms of impact, but also opportunities. So the equivalent of Paris is added in floor space every 5 days. And I like to take the example of Paris because, as I said, we are located in Paris. And half of the buildings standing in 2050, 60, depending on the model that you apply, have not even been built yet. So we do have this opportunity to get it right or to carry the consequences afterwards, which would be much more expensive. And this is, even though buildings are one of the most cost-effective mitigation solutions, especially through circular economy approaches. And at the same time, they are also a massive job creation machine. So we are really looking at a win-win solution here. Just in terms of finance, the International Finance Corporation, IFC, estimates that green buildings is a 24.6 $6.7 trillion investment opportunity by 2030. And there are some estimates saying that 2/3 of global wealth are actually stored in real estate. So these are really massive figures also in terms of finance. Okay, before I go on with facts and figures, allow me to say a few words about the Global ABC for those of you who don't yet know us. We were founded at COP21 really with the aim of putting buildings and construction on the map, on the spot, when it comes to climate action. As I said, we are hosted by UNEP. We started with 79 members. We are now 238 members. We've really experienced a lot of growth, which I think just mirrors the fact that there's really a growing awareness for the importance of buildings. And this includes 36 countries. We're a leading global platform because we include really all stakeholder groups, including governments, but also including a lot of private sector entities and very large corporations, civil society, a lot of universities, but also intergovernmental organizations. And we're all committed to a common vision, a zero-emission, efficient, and resilient buildings and construction sector. Now, concretely, what does this mission mean? We worked together with the UNFCCC on what we call a human settlements pathway, and this vision has been built with a lot of stakeholders, so there is a certain degree of legitimacy around it, that by 2030 we need to halve the built environment emission, and by 2050 all buildings should be decarbonized along the life cycle. And of course here circular economy solutions are absolutely critical, and without that will not be possible to achieve this vision. Now, the vision is more detailed with concrete actions for each stakeholder group, and I won't go into that detail now, but if you're interested in knowing more, I'm happy to share the links with you. A few words about what we actually do. So we have 3 core activities and objectives. One is to be a catalyst, deep collaboration between these many stakeholder groups, and we're working on tools such as building passports. There's a pilot project going on right now in Morocco, for example. The other thing that is very important to us is to track progress and to set targets on a global level. And for that, we have our global status report for buildings and construction, which comes out every year, and every year it has a different regional and topical focus. This year, it will be Africa, also in line with the COP27 taking place in Egypt and Africa. And the topical focus this year will be materials. So again, very important link here to circular approaches. And the third one is to support countries based on their situation. And there, what is really important for us is to develop decarbonization roadmaps, always with and through relevant ministries in those countries. That is a very important approach for us. Okay, a few words about tracking progress, a few facts and figures here. So this is an exercise that we did last year for the 2021 iteration. And the reason why I like to show this is because I think it is important to show the magnitude of the problem, but it's also important to show that we are making progress, because I think this highlights what is working, and it also just gives encouragement and hope, and that is important. So we are seeing here that between 2015 and 2020, those are the 2 time points that we compared here, we see a massive growth in the number of nationally determined contributions that mention buildings, almost 55% increase, and a growth in a number of countries with building energy codes, which is a very important measure of over 30%. We see that energy intensity is decreasing, while for floor area globally, these are all global figures, is increasing. So there is a certain decoupling that we can see. The same for emissions intensity. The message here is that the direction is right, but the speed is not. The speed is not sufficient. And to that end, I want to talk about the Global Buildings Climate Tracker. So what you see here on the left side, the zoomed out graph, where you see the sort of little snake that raises its head. That's what it looks like to me, at least. You see the endpoint by 2050 as zero carbon building stock. That's where we want to go. Now, if you zoom in to check where we currently are, the interesting thing that you can see here, again, this is data from 2020, is that if we ignored the fact that 2020 was a very strange year because of COVID-19 impacts, it actually looks as though we are on track. And that's because COVID had a massive impact in terms of construction projects being put on hold, building materials becoming scarce, therefore imports not happening, and so on. So it looks as though we're on track, but if you calculate the COVID impacts out, and indeed we should, because we see that the economies are almost back to where they were before, we are actually far away from the goal. So again, the message is the direction is right, but the speed is not. Okay, a few more facts and figures about buildings and construction and why this is so important, not just in terms of emissions and energy. So the facts here are, the current profile is 37% of energy-related CO2 emissions come from buildings and construction, and 36% of final energy demand come from buildings and construction. Now, I should say that the emissions figure is very likely an underestimate, and that is because certain things such as bricks and everything that's to do with bricks is not included. The same for certain types of emissions that stem from material production, especially cement, and the chemical reactions there with clinker. That's because of the data availability. So actually, the emission figures are probably higher. But I want to talk to you not just about emissions and energy, but also really about why this is such a win-win to address energy, to address buildings and construction in general. So it really is a job creation machine, as I said earlier. Between 9 and 13 jobs in manufacturing and construction would be created for every $1 million invested in retrofits or energy efficiency measures. When we just look at home retrofits, 60% of expenditure go towards labor. I should say that the 60% figure is a figure from Europe. So it might be a little different for other regions, especially perhaps regions where there's a lot of new construction. But the overall trend remains valid. This is a job creation machine, and a lot of these jobs are local, which is also important. Okay, I talked to you about codes earlier, and codes are really, really important. Codes are really a measure to push markets. And it's really important that codes be mandatory, and that codes, well, I talk about energy codes here, that they include the whole life cycle of the building. So not just the operations part of the building, but also the materials part, the embodied carbon part, that it includes regulation of what types of materials can and should be used. If we look at the global situation, and despite the fact that a lot of countries are now adding codes, building energy codes, which is a good thing, if we look at which countries have mandatory building energy codes for the entire sector, it is only 22%. So there really is a lot of work that remains to be done. I told you earlier that a lot of countries are now adding buildings to NDCs, and actually what we see is that energy efficiency improvement in buildings are now the second most mentioned measure in NDCs after renewable energy generation. That is a good thing. And right now we have 146 countries mentioning buildings in their NDCs. But again, there is a big but, which is that certain areas really remain underaddressed, and they are important for circularity, such as building materials, such as how do you design a building. So it's not just about whether buildings are mentioned, but also in what manner are they mentioned in the NDC. So here you can see a map. I'm going to skip over that. The third pillar of our activities, as I said, is to support countries based on their situation. And to that end, we have developed a roadmap. This actually has started in 2016 with a global roadmap. We have regionalized this in 2020 through input from 700 stakeholders. And I actually think AIT was involved in that, which we are very grateful for. And we determined 8 areas that are key to address the entire buildings and construction sector, and really also to make sure that there is a strong circularity element when we are addressing buildings, so that it's not just about addressing the standing building on its own, but the entire sector, the entire neighborhood, and the building from start to finish. So these 8 categories are urban planning, new buildings, existing buildings, operations, appliances, materials, resilience, and clean energy. And for each of these, we have set targets by 2030 and 2050 and key policy and technology measures for each. Again, this is input really based on input from a lot of stakeholders. So we like to think that this gives it a certain degree of legitimacy. We have a lot of roadmaps going on, and I should really emphasize that whenever we are now cascading these roadmaps to the national or sub-regional level, it is always with and through the ministry of the respective country or the local governance. We think this is extremely important because we recognize that each country does have different priorities just alone based on their geographic and climatic conditions. So right now, for instance, there are roadmaps that are almost being finished in Cambodia and Vietnam with respective ministries of construction. And there are roadmap processes going on in over 30 countries. A really nice example for us is the United Arab Emirates, which have taken our model and they are cascading it to 22 Arab states on their own, which we think is a very, very nice thing. And we have a roadmap hub where we unite every entity that works on roadmaps to exchange knowledge and see what has worked and what maybe has not worked. Okay, we also have a massive project on materials. It's just started in UNEP that will take place especially in Senegal, Ghana, India, and Bangladesh, with policy briefs on materials and embodied carbon and an information hub on building materials with support for roadmap development, especially around materials and with strong aspects of circularity. And here you can see our sub-working groups. I won't go into detail. What I do want to mention, if you're keen on joining us in this materials working group, you're very welcome to do so. This is absolutely open. So you can just contact us at global.abc@un.org. And if you want to become a member of the Global ABC, you're very welcome to apply. It's very easy to spot how to on our website, globalabc.org. And with that, back over to you. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Nora. It's such a wonderful piece of information which related to the infrastructures and broken down into these constructions and building is really adding a good information to us because in the past 3 days, I think we need this to fill in terms of the constructions. So now I would like to welcome questions or any comments or observation from the audience to Nora with regard to her information on the presentations. And for those interested, you can use the microphone. You can switch on your microphone, or you feel free also to type, but preferably voice. Nora, one thing that I reserve the question that we had yesterday about the construction material. One of the colleagues asked with regard to construction waste management. So is there any wavelengths or chemistry which is moving around in the developing world that this is also one of the issues which is related to the construction materials front, which you know about?
Thank you for the question. I'm not 100% sure if I understood every aspect of the question, but just in terms of, obviously, like waste from the buildings and construction process is quite massive, as you rightly point out. And I think it's actually not so much on people's minds, because I think when you think of waste, you think of plastic, right? Which is very important, no doubt. But actually, buildings and construction waste make up, I think, something like 2/3 or even 3/4 of the waste that we have, the landfill. However, it is important to point out that a lot of that waste is actually being reused. It's just not being reused, let me say, in an efficient way, in a sense of it's not being reused, necessarily for other construction projects. And that's what it should be reused for, right? Because it's construction materials. So there, I think what's really important is just to design buildings completely differently from the start, right? Just to design them as material banks. So really to see them as we are storing building materials for future use, not as we're using it now and then afterwards it gets scrapped and maybe used for something else or not. And obviously, like, toxic chemicals are a really important element to that from the landfill. I hope that answered your question somewhat. I'm not sure if I understood every aspect, but I think it's a really important point that you raised.
100% is very straightforward, and yes, so also colleagues ask about which country that they can follow about the construction waste management and so on and so forth. So that's okay. Now, perhaps another thing is that how did you see the perceptions of the construction companies, big or small, in relation to these new ideas of circularity? Do you think that they will follow this, very easily, or they will have to take time to, to spin off, especially on the cost side of the initiative?
So I think in general, there are a lot of companies that are really, really interested and willing to go this extra mile. Surely there are some that are not, but just if we look at, for instance, like the amount of companies that are putting in place what we call science-based targets, which is dubbed sometimes the business NDC, right? These are, and the science-based target should usually address scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, or emissions along the entire life cycle. And we see a lot of demand here from, I think, construction companies. It's around 60, I think it's 66 that have it. It's not enough, but we do see a lot of demand. Same for the Race to Zero, which was put in place last year before COP26. We also see a lot of demands there from companies and from manufacturers, as well as from design companies. So that is good, but I think, well, first of all, there are still a lot of companies that, for whatever reason, maybe because they haven't heard of it, or because they feel they don't know where to start, just haven't put in place even commitments. And the second thing is that, I mean, in our minds, we can't go around the fact that we need to have some key regulations in place. Otherwise, it's quite hard for companies, honestly, and I don't want to make any excuses. But you know, the value chain of the buildings and construction sector is so fragmented and complex that it's actually difficult for a single construction company with their actions to change the entire value chain if there isn't certain regulation in place that already addresses the entire value chain, such as a performance-based building code that also includes materials. It is possible, and we know some companies, especially architectural companies, that actually manage to themselves build up supply chains, local supply chains for alternative materials, so that, you know, we're not just using, I guess, you know, what we call modern buildings, glass and steel. That is, it's happening. But if we want to take it to scale, I think we can't get around some key regulations.
Thank you, Nora. We have two questions from the floor. Anila, can you ask your question by voice, please? So it will be more exciting. Anila, could you do it?
Yes, sir. My question, first of all, the presentation is really informative. Thank you. I would like to ask you that how this organization is influencing to the developing nation like Nepal, where the energy efficient code has not been fully formulated. So in terms of the efficient construction, how this organization is helping toward the developing nation. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. It's a really important one. And, you know, I think one thing that would be really interesting and useful to do is really to be able to work with countries like Nepal who are keen on making the updates for codes that are needed, and working with you together and seeing, okay, what does the current code look like, and what would an ideal code based on your geographic and climatic conditions look like, and how can we include things like materials to really push circularity and energy efficiency. I think for that, what would be really great is to have something like what I like to call model regulations in place, like to be able to point to, okay, this would be an ideal code. I have to be honest, we don't currently have that, and I really would like to work on that. So, you know, please get in touch and we can see what we can do. There is a possibility that we might work with Egypt on something like that. I know this is a very different climatic location, but just to say, we're really keen to get this started. The other thing is that, you know, I mentioned roadmaps earlier, and the roadmaps that we have, they certainly make strong reference to code. And the roadmap, I think, has the advantage that it doesn't just address one singular regulatory mechanism like codes, but it really looks at the all aspects of the buildings and construction sector. So again, we are currently doing this, that we're cascading these roadmaps to national level of countries. There isn't one, as far as I'm aware, there isn't one for Nepal. There is one, as I said, for Vietnam and for Cambodia. There is one that's starting for India, for Bangladesh. There is one in Indonesia. So there is some in the region. But again, we'd be really keen to expand this. So maybe if you like, you can get in touch with us via the email. We tend to answer quite quickly, and we can see whether we can work with you on this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Fakul, would you like to address your questions verbally? I mean, this is interesting regarding to retrofittings of the buildings. Fakul?
Yeah, yes, thank you, sir. My question is actually the existing buildings. That is the retrofitting. It is one of the main solution for the existing buildings to decarbonization in future. But ETAP is more technical, and as well as it also is a lot of expertise have to be required to establish the retrofitting in future, so that if there are any strategy or plan to disseminate this new technology in the retrofitting for young engineers in terms of the global ABC. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a really excellent question. And, you know, I think one thing that's really important is that we have some formalized training. So, of course, there are things in place like, you know, massive open online courses and so on, but I'm not sure that they really fill the gap that we have. I think what's very important is that, like, targeted trainings on what is key for retrofits in each region, that they be part of university trainings, or that they be, and some already are, that they be part for certain types of qualifications. Like I know, for instance, I think the LEED label is now requiring training in life cycle analysis. Now, this is a really good thing and a really interesting thing because it actually creates markets. So I think some things like that are important to do. One thing that I should mention, and I haven't really emphasized that before, is the global ABC. Our mission is really, you know, creating these frameworks and awareness raising. We don't implement, so we don't have projects on the ground. It's not part of our mission, but I completely see what you're saying, and you're absolutely right. And in an ideal world, what we would love to do is work with countries and really establish these more formalized trainings for engineers, for architects, because, you know, you're right. We see this, that there is a lot of motivation and will to do things differently. But if the original institutionalized training wasn't to that end, and if the regulatory environment isn't pushing that, what can you do? You know, and another thing is, for instance, we also see that, you know, in some countries we have per se, we have very good regulation, but then when we see the public procurement, for instance, for public buildings, actually the amount of money offered isn't even enough to address all the requirements for sustainable buildings. So again, that it's not a good incentive. So these are the kind of things we need to change. So the short answer is, unfortunately, no, we don't have these formalized trainings in place yet, but we would really love to.
Yeah, very good questions. Very
Thank
good.
you, sir.
Interesting. I have maybe final comments to 3 points quickly. One is this is very useful, and Nora, the categories of 8 types of the subsectors of the building and constructions is also very useful to AIT as well, because it can be part of the curriculums. It can be part of training and capacity building program that we can focus on. That is very interesting. And also, I think your final slide in the department of different things, which is also include capacity building, and those are the area where we can perhaps work within the networks and also the institutions in order to strengthen the capacities in various levels. With that, I have a curiosity about how much extent that this construction and building would also emphasize to the job creations when it is going to the local government and by participation of the potential employees at the local level. Just to ask whether we can extend that from the circularity point of view to the social point of view.
Yes, thank you. This is an excellent point, and I think it's underemphasized because when we speak of buildings and construction, I think there's 2 issues with communication. One is we tend to only talk about the technical aspects, so sort of, you know, speaking in engineering or architectural language, when really I think we should also be talking about the fact that this is housing, it's people's homes. And the other thing is what you just said, the social benefits, and they are massive. I mean, as I mentioned, we have between 9 and 30 jobs created for every $1 million invested. It might not in and of itself sound that much, but it is if you compare it to other sectors. If in other sectors you were to do energy efficiency measures, it's much job heavier for buildings and construction, and this is a really good thing. So, I mean, really for local government, for national and for local governments, if you address buildings, retrofits, also new buildings, but mostly retrofits, if you engage in a massive retrofits programs, you really see benefits for the people, and you see it pretty quickly, and that's important. Obviously we can't just talk about climate change and energy if we can't communicate to people that this is also really improves their lives, right? And then there's the other effects like energy efficiency, decreasing utility bills for people and so on, which is also important. It raises a whole level of other questions. We do hear sometimes concern from affordable housing associations that say, yes, okay, maybe it decreases utility bills, but it makes housing even more unaffordable. It's a valid concern, but at the end of the day, I think, it's the poor who can least afford to be in inefficient housing. They need it most. So we just need to find ways to overcome these sort of split incentives.
Truly, final question from Abdul Khalid, please. Abdul, Mr. Khalid, you raise your hand.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. The nice presentation about building and global ABC. But the global ABC has a regional, global, and international roadmap. My question is, how many countries follow this roadmap, and how global ABC monitors the member countries' progress are following the roadmap? Another last question is there any country level or regional level office of global ABC? Thank you.
I heard the first part, but not the last part of the question. But maybe you can start with the first part, and then, if I may, I would ask you to repeat the last part. So for the roadmaps, I should say that it's still a fairly new process. So the global one we released in 2016, the regional ones for Africa, Asia, and Latin America we released in 2020. And because obviously it's still at a very macro level, because the region of Asia itself is huge and very, very diverse, we are now cascading it to the national and sub-regional level. So globally, currently, we have national and sub-regional roadmap processes going on in 30 countries. It's not enough, but it's a start. What we usually do is, so we always work with the national ministries, right? In Cambodia and Vietnam, for instance, with the ministries of construction. And we tie the roadmap to the NDC of the country, the nationally determined contribution, so that there is a certain monitoring mechanism. And so that we can come back year by year and see, are the steps being followed, essentially. And we have, of course, a timeline in there, which is targets to be reached by 2030 and by 2050. However, at the end of the day, it is up to the country how fast they go and how much they implement. I think one thing that's really key for us that we've really learned is that when we put in place roadmaps, at the same time as working on the roadmap, we need to put in place finance mechanisms so that the implementation can actually happen. It's a bit of a paradox in the buildings and construction sector, though, because my understanding is that on the one hand, finance institutions like development banks, they say, look, we have a lot of finance available, but we're not finding bankable projects. We're not getting the money out of the door, essentially. And on the other hand, we see construction projects, we see local governments, we see NGOs saying, we would love to build more green, but we're lacking the means. So we need to find a way to bridge that, and we're hoping that roadmaps can help. But I think one thing that's really important is also to link the roadmaps to established labels that finance institutions can use. Like, I know that the EBRD, for instance, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, when they finance, and they are one of the ones who are facing this dilemma, when they're funding buildings and construction projects, they can accept the LEED label, the BREEAM label, and the EDGE certification. So I think it's really important for us as a roadmap development to link the roadmaps to NDCs, but also to these types of labels, so that we sort of help unlock finance.
Thank you so much. I think that we will need to have another sessions focusing on this only, because there are many areas and also issues that we can discuss and explore. I also have a personal interest in this, that I believe that we can also extend to look into the details of different pillars of this building construction. Thank you so much, Nora, for your presentation and for your very useful information, including the presentation that you make and also the guidelines that you show to us.
Thank you so much for welcoming me today. It was really a pleasure and an honor exchanging with you and looking forward to continuing. Thank you.
To see you again. Yes, sure. So the next we will hear from Jean Chia from Singapore, the application of the constructions and building approach for livable city. So Jean Chia, now your turn, please. Welcome to the forum. Yes.
Thank you so much, and very happy to be to join everybody here in this session. I think this is the last day of your program, right? And probably I think I'm the last session for the day, right? So I'll try.
Close to the last. We have one more video. Yes.
Okay, close to the last. So I do hope I'll bring some interesting interesting example to share with you on this topic. I will be, of course, be kind of focusing on sustainable infrastructure development, in particular in public housing context in Singapore. So maybe just a quick check. I hope everybody can hear me clearly. That's great. And just give me a moment to share my slides. Okay, so I hope everybody can see that. It's good.
Yes, good.
Okay, great. Right. So, so once again, thank you so much for the opportunity to share a little bit about the sustainable infrastructure development approach that we're taking here in Singapore, particularly in a public housing context, right? So maybe just a little bit of background on myself. I've spent quite a few years in the government service, public sector here in Singapore. Firstly with the economic portfolio, but then I moved on to also looking at development issues, especially physical infrastructure development. I was also with a research think tank that's under our ministry, Singapore's Ministry of National Development, right? So that ministry looks at things like housing, land use planning, building regulations, and actually also green spaces and parks development as well, right? So I wanted to first start really to give you an overview of public housing in Singapore, right? And this is actually a picture of one of the youngest public housing towns in Singapore. It's called Pongo New Town, right? I mean, public housing has kind of evolved in Singapore over the years. So we didn't start out with public housing looking like this, of course, right? It was more simple designs, really the kind of idea of resettling people and providing affordable homes to people. So the designs and approach has evolved over the years as well, right? And if you've been to Singapore, I'm not sure if how many of you are familiar with Singapore, but if you've been to Singapore, you probably would have seen some examples of our public housing in Singapore. And that's really because we're talking about a large-scale public housing program, right? We're talking about mass public housing here in Singapore. And that's quite different from when you hear about, I think quite a few, most countries, when you hear about public housing or social housing, is some of the terms they use, is actually quite a different approach, right? But first, maybe let me give you the context of Singapore. I think most of you will be aware, Singapore's a fairly small place. We are pretty much a small city-state, just about 730 square kilometers of land to play with within Singapore. So really quite small and also quite tight on land space. But yet at the same time, we have a relatively high population density. It's almost 8,000 per square kilometer. So we have today about if I remember, I think about 5.7 million people in Singapore today, right? And we have, in terms of, like I mentioned, a mass public housing program, right? So to date, we have more than 1 million of these public housing flats, and we often refer to them as HDB flats. And that's because the government agency in charge of public housing in Singapore is called the Housing and Development Board. So HDB for short, right? So we have more than 1 million of these flats across Singapore in 24 of these new towns like Pongo, and also a few other smaller estates as well, right? And if you can imagine then, when I talk about scale, it's large scale, it's a mass public housing program. To give you some idea of how big that scale is, really about 80% of the resident population here in Singapore actually live in public housing. So some examples that you see, like the flats that you see here in Pongo, those buildings with the white levels. So that's some examples of the public housing that we have, right? And there's a high home ownership. So amongst that population living in public housing in Singapore, I would say about 90 or maybe a bit more than 90% of them actually own their own homes. So we do buy it from the government agency that develops public housing, which is the Housing and Development Board. Right. I also do want to touch a little bit about the role of the Housing and Development Board, or HDB. So it is the sole agency in charge of public housing. So there's a very clear definition of its role, right? It's the sole agency in charge of public housing development in Singapore. And the HDB also takes sort of a comprehensive approach towards housing development. And that means its role really starts about identifying where these public housing towns should be located, planning them, designing them, acquiring the land if that's needed to build on, and also actually then, of course, implementing and constructing, developing these the public housing units, as well as, of course, the town that is contained in, right? So it's really very much a comprehensive role. So one agency with a comprehensive role, a very clear mandate, and of course, strong government backing as well, right? And that can come in the form of, it has a strong legislative mandate. It also receives subsidies as well from the government to carry out its public housing development role, right? So I hope I've given you sort of a quick overview of public housing, which is a little different, I would say, quite a bit different from maybe the approach taken in many other places where public housing or social housing is often really just a small portion of the total housing stock. Whereas in Singapore, it's really mass public housing, and that's meant to be affordable to most of the population, right?
Yeah,
okay.
That's interesting.
Right, so I mentioned it's 24 HDB new towns, public housing towns, in 3 estates that's actually spread all across Singapore. So you see the spaces in red, those are the HDB towns and estates across in Singapore. And we're going to really focus on Pongo New Town. If you remember, I showed you the picture earlier on. We're going to focus on Pongo New Town as an example. In fact, we're going to focus on a particular district in Pongo. We'll talk about a lot more about that in a short while. But I just wanted to also share a little bit about Pongo itself. Right, it's one of the youngest new towns to be developed by HDB, and it's really positioned also as the first eco town, right? And I would say if you roll back to maybe the early 2000s, if you went to visit Pongo, it would have been a relatively quiet town because it was just starting to develop. But of course, today it's very much a bustling new town. The population in Pongo New Town is roughly about 180,000 with about 50,000 housing units within Pongo itself. Right, so and in terms of land area, it's about 960 hectares. I actually did a quick check. I think it's roughly about 4/5 or 80% of the size of Phi Island in Thailand. Right, so if you're familiar with that, I hope that gives you a sense of the size of Pongo. And of course, it's just one of the new towns that we have in Singapore. So, right. So, but what was special about Pongo was that it was really positioned as the first eco town where HDB started to implement some of these more sustainable development approaches and started to pilot them in Pongo itself. Okay. Right. So, what are some of the environmental kind of challenges that Singapore faces, especially when you talk about public housing? Of course, the limited natural resources. As a small city-state, we have very limited natural resources. Land itself is very tight, very limited for us as well. But yet, at the same time, we also have to deal with a relatively high population density. We are, of course, also like many other countries, vulnerable to the effects of climate change, especially when you talk about the rising temperatures, more intense, more extreme weather and things like rainstorms, and of course, rising sea levels as well. One other thing we also have to kind of manage when it comes about environmental challenges is really also this urban heat island effect. And that's also because Singapore is pretty much pretty built up. And with all these concrete structures and the areas that are largely built up, that also tends to actually trap heat and makes us even hotter. It makes us hotter even besides if you're looking at the effects of climate change as well. So it's making the effect of climate change a little worse for us as well in terms of temperature. And of course, like I mentioned, Singapore being a fairly built up place, we also have to be kind of careful that that Singapore doesn't become too much of a concrete jungle. Development is of course necessary for us, but at the same time, we also want to try as much as possible to balance that with some of the more naturalistic effects. And I'll take a look at how we've kind of tried to do that here in Singapore in Pongo, right? I just want to also quickly share a little bit about the Singapore Green Plan 2030, right? And that's really our plan to tackle climate change. I know this slide is a little crowded, so I've highlighted in those red boxes some of the more relevant points that actually are more relevant to when you talk about public housing development in Singapore. So for example, it could, through green citizenry, for example, in sustainable living or green commutes. I'll kind of also talk a little bit about how we try to incorporate that through the public housing in Pongo. And of course, things like creating livable, sustainable homes for Singaporeans, how we incorporate also the greener infrastructure, green buildings, and try to reduce energy use and also incorporate green energy as well. Okay, and of course, talk a little bit about how we've tried to keep Singapore cool also through the infrastructure. Okay, so I want to zoom in, talk quite a bit about Pongo and public housing in Singapore, and that's kind of like a close-up of the area, the Pongo area, and the precinct, this precinct in particular, Tree Lodge. You see it right, almost kind of like in the center of Pongo. So it's actually really quite well located, even within Pongo, Pongo New Town. So this is the precinct that I like to kind of focus on. And it's really Singapore's first public housing eco precinct. So it's actually very much a sort of like a pilot. When you talk about sustainable development, and also sort of like a living laboratory. Singapore, we like to talk about the idea of having living labs, right? You pilot with them, and you actually have residents living there already. In fact, this was completed actually more than 10 years ago, around 2010, right? This is how it looks like today, right? So this is a precinct in Pongo itself. It's the first eco precinct. It's about 2.9 hectares. And on this plot of land, you have about 712 units in 7 residential blocks. Right, and in a public housing context, this precinct was actually the first to be awarded the Green Mark Platinum. So that's Singapore's version of for green building standards, right? And the picture I've shown you is kind of how it looks like today, right? And this is kind of like the plan view of Tree Lodge. If you look at it, so with the 7 blocks, it's not a lot of space. So it's actually quite also again, of course, comes back to Singapore's approach towards public housing. Is really tends to be higher density and of course high rise, right, to be able to fit our population, right? So there are quite a few different aspects that we incorporated, sustainable aspects that we incorporated into Tree Lodge, and I'll kind of touch on each one of these, right? I'm really going to start really at the rooftop of Tree Lodge. So this is a view of the rooftops at Tree Lodge. Every rooftop at Tree Lodge, it's really been fitted out with solar PV panels, right? So they can tap on solar energy, right? So I mentioned Singapore, we have limited natural resources. In terms of renewable energies, for us, solar energy is probably one with the highest potential for us. Being in the tropics, being in Southeast Asia, in the tropics, of course, we get a fair amount of solar energy as well. But quite often for us, a key issue is space, right? We don't have like some other countries where you have vast amounts of space, a desert or something where you can actually kind of install a lot of solar PV panels. So for us, rooftops is actually one opportunity. And we incorporate, and in Tree Lodge, they started to test this out in a public housing context. So on the rooftops of all the blocks at Tree Lodge, right, you actually have these solar panels installed. And this was really the first solar PV integrated public housing project. So as Tree Lodge was designed, as a planning for Tree Lodge, they actually incorporated this aspect up front as well, so that you could plan properly for it as when this precinct was being developed, right? And that feeds into the energy reset. If you remember that the green plan that I showed earlier about Singapore's plan in terms of to tackle climate change. So that also feeds into the energy reset aspect of the green plan, right? By tapping on renewable energy. And a lot of this, the electricity that's generated from these panels, PV panels, really goes into users for common areas in Tree Lodge itself. So for example, things like the lighting in the common areas of Tree Lodge, the corridors, staircases, things like that. And of course, also kind of powering the lifts as well at Tree Lodge, right? So in this diagram, you might actually also have seen a little bit of greenery under the solar PV, right? So that's another aspect of the rooftops at Tree Lodge, where they've started it, where they tried incorporating green roofs, right? So this is actually sort of an approach that HDB developed called the prefabricated extensive green, or PEG, right? So these are not elaborate gardens, but really the idea is to use relatively lightweight material, relatively hardy plants, right? Because so that they don't need a lot of maintenance. And the idea is to actually be able to kind of incorporate them onto the rooftop fairly quickly, and not too costly to HDB as well, right? And having these green roofs is really to reduce the heat absorption at the rooftops, right? So otherwise, most of this would actually have been concrete. Typically, it would have been concrete, and they tend to be quite hot, and especially for units at the top levels, right, near to the roofs, right? So with these things like incorporating some of these green roofs, the idea is to actually reduce the heat absorption actually at the rooftops as well. And that feeds into that idea of keeping Singapore cool, right? Planning for a more resilient future, right? There is also one other aspect on the rooftop. So they've actually tried to pack in quite a few different systems on the rooftops at Tree Lodge. There's this rainwater harvesting system, right? So we get a lot of sunshine. We also get quite a lot of rain as well. In Singapore, we try to kind of actually capture as much of the rain as we can, because water is a precious resource for us. So at the rooftops of Tree Lodge, they've actually incorporated this rainwater harvesting system. So rain that falls on the rooftops actually do get channeled through the green roof system that you see to help filter out some of the water, and actually then goes into this simple treatment process before being stored in these water tanks at a rooftop, near to the rooftop areas, right? And this water actually is then used for things like washing of the common corridor areas. So rather than tapping on the water supply directly, we're actually kind of reusing the rainwater to actually do things like, for non-potable users, things like washing common areas in the Tree Lodge precinct, or of course things like irrigation and watering of plants, right? So just on this area of water conservation also, within the units at Tree Lodge, it was actually the first time they've actually incorporated something called the eco pedestals. I think it's fairly common today. It wasn't so common for us when Tree Lodge was first developed, right? So the idea is, if you see in the diagram, the eco pedestal is that you first use the water at the first use, you can use it for hand washing, and then it travels into your toilet system, where you can then, second round, you can use it for toilet flushing, so that you kind of use it more than once as well, right? So some of these ideas were incorporated in the units, in the residential units. Now I'll talk a little bit about the energy. I've talked about how we're kind of harnessing solar power on the rooftops. And that goes into powering things like the lighting and things like the lifts, right? And the lift system itself, what they implemented in Tree Lodge was to actually have a more energy efficient lift system. So this lift system actually uses 10% less energy, and it actually also has the regenerates energy during the braking phase as well, and that then goes back into the use of the lift system. So besides the lift system being more energy efficient, we've also, in terms of the lighting as well, switched to LED and also use motion sensor lighting, especially in areas where you don't have high human traffic as well. So these are some of the examples of how they try to cut energy use in Tree Lodge, right? So again, some of these are quite common already in a lot of our housing estates, but they were actually first kind of piloted in Pongo and in Tree Lodge itself before being rolled out in other public housing estates in Singapore. Right, I talked about keeping also ways of keeping Singapore cool, right? One other way that they've used in Tree Lodge was actually to use passive building design. So that's really using the natural attributes of the location, be it some kind of like the wind flow, the sunlight and shading. So you are using a passive design approach to really try to keep the precinct cool. So Tree Lodge was actually orientated with this northeast-southwest orientation. And if you're familiar with building, that actually minimizes the exposure that the units have to the hottest times of the day. So you try to reduce the number of units that are west-facing, for example, so you don't get too much of the direct afternoon sun when the sun is actually at its strongest. So only about 15%, I think, of the units at Tree Lodge actually have more of a west exposure. So we try and minimize that exposure for most of the units. Also, at the same time, for these units, they have actually incorporated sort of an approach where they included insulation into the walls for those facades, to actually try to minimize the heat absorption by the buildings. So that's one way that we try to keep Tree Lodge feeling a little cooler. The other aspect also, if you can see the shadowing in this image here, the shadowing, so it was also positioned such that the blocks themselves actually provide shade to the common areas between the blocks, right? So if you see, there's actually this stretch of passageways and some of these greenery in between the blocks. So it was also planned such that the blocks could actually provide shade, especially from the afternoon sun. And even things like where to put the playgrounds or fitness corners, actually also considered things like this shading, the amount of shading it would get actually as well. And really, so Tree Lodge itself was actually the first project by HDB to actually use more detailed computer modeling to try to kind of understand all these microclimatic conditions and try to maximize them. So it wasn't just at the precinct level, but also the block level, and then even at the unit level. So quite detailed computer modeling that was incorporated in planning Tree Lodge itself, right? Okay, so I talked about that passive design approach, right? The other aspect is, of course, using white paint, and also the paint itself was self-cleansing as well, right? On the building facade, self-cleansing so that it reduces the amount of maintenance that's needed. At the same time, also there are simple design elements, things like a sun shading device. So we see the two parts of the diagram where I've kind of circled in red, right? These were the kind of the simple sun shading devices that were incorporated into the facades of the blocks at Tree Lodge to just provide that shade from the sun as well. Okay. And in terms of the building technology, in Tree Lodge, it was actually a lot of it was actually also constructed using precast technology, right? So the idea is to actually manufacture parts of the building. So it could be a stairwell, could be maybe the storerooms or some of the toilets or certain walls, but actually manufactured off-site. So not at the Tree Lodge site itself, but manufactured off-site somewhere else, and then later on brought to Tree Lodge to actually be kind of be fitted together and to build up Tree Lodge, the blocks at Tree Lodge in this approach. And that really also helps to reduce the amount of waste during the construction phase. At the same time, also reduces, I think, also the amount of dust and noise that we normally associate with construction sites as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was some of the more sustainable construction approach they adopted at Tree Lodge. I want to talk a little bit also about the recycling approach in Tree Lodge. So, I mean, of course, there's a lot of push for recycling and public housing estates, given that they're so widespread in Singapore, that's actually a great opportunity to kind of encourage recycling amongst residents, right? And for existing HDB public housing blocks in Singapore, the approach has actually been to actually have this blue bin that you see in the picture here. It's at the foot of the block, at the ground level of the block. So it's like a centralized blue bin. So if you had things to recycle, if you're staying there, you'd kind of bring your recycling items down and kind of put them into the blue recycling bin. Okay, so normally you do not find that that little Pokemon sitting at the blue bin. Okay, so that doesn't usually come with the blue bin, right? But that's an example of how we've been trying to implement recycling at existing HDB blocks. So in Tree Lodge, they took a different approach, right? So instead of having the blue bin at the foot of the ground floor of the blocks, they actually had these recycling chutes. You can see in the diagrams here, the recycling chutes at every level of Tree Lodge. So it's a centralized recycling chute. On the other side, so you can see this in the bigger picture, you can see the recycling chute on the left side of the picture. There's actually also another rubbish chute for general waste as well, right? So these are actually located at every level of Tree Lodge. Right, the idea being that you want to make it as simple as possible for residents to recycle. So instead of having to go bring your recycling items down to the bottom of the block, they actually have access to it at every level, right? So they just need to pop out of their house. They can actually put their recyclables into the chute. So you have to kind of be aware and put them into the right chute, because one is for general waste and the other one is for recycling, right? So the idea was to make it as convenient and simple as possible in Tree Lodge, right? I want to talk a little bit about incorporating nature or incorporating greenery at Tree Lodge. So, and that was very much a key feature of Tree Lodge right from the start. So the picture on the left that you see here was when Tree Lodge was first completed. They already had the greenery, the plates, spaces, green spaces already fitted out. But of course, it was the plants that hadn't grown out yet. So today on the picture on the right, you see that the greenery has actually grown out. It's a lot more developed and looks a lot more greener as well. So it doesn't just look nice. The idea is also, of course, to provide shade and also to reduce the kind of heat absorption from some of the surfaces actually at these levels as well. Okay, so you can see the green spine at this level of Tree Lodge, right? And there's just some more examples of the greenery that you can see around this Tree Lodge precinct itself. It's a small precinct, but they've actually really tried to kind of incorporate as much greenery as possible, right? So we have things like also a community garden that's on the top left-hand corner, a community garden where residents in Tree Lodge can actually come together and do some planting as well. So there's actually, so it also serves as sort of like a social gathering spot as well for residents there. Right, and you see some of the other examples where you actually have more of a vertical greenery as well. Residents at Tree Lodge, some of them have balconies. So the idea was also to encourage the residents themselves to actually do planting and incorporate greenery as well. So you see some examples of how our residents have been using planting as well and at the balcony. Okay. Right, so those were the kind of the features of Tree Lodge at the infrastructure, the building level. Right, I want to talk also a little bit more about the town planning approach. And that's not only at Tree Lodge, actually that's a town planning approach that's adopted throughout Singapore in terms of public housing. And really the idea is to have this neighborhood concept. Right, so we think about your towns at different scales, at different levels. You have the town scale, right? That's of course the entire new town. You also think about it at the neighborhood or district level. So each new town would have maybe several neighborhoods, and then each neighborhood is again broken down into a precinct as well. So each neighborhood will have several precincts as well, right? And the idea is to actually plan accordingly in terms of facilities and infrastructure needed at different levels, at different scales as well, right? And we also try to incorporate, of course, this integrated land use and transport planning approach. And the idea is really to make your towns as self-sufficient as possible and convenient for your residents. And by doing so, by having different facilities, amenities available at different levels, you also try to reduce the amount of travel that your residents need to do as well. So, and if they do need to travel, then of course things like public transport is also convenient options for residents, right? So just keep in mind those three levels, kind of like looking at it town, neighborhood, and precinct level when it comes to town planning, okay? So I just wanted to share, remember Tree Lodge is quite well located also within Pongo itself. It's quite centrally located. You see the purple, kind of purple lines there and the gray lines. Those are actually the light rail transit system, the gray lines. And we also have the heavier kind of mass rapid transit system, MRT, a subway system, which is the purple line. So Tree Lodge itself is already quite well located, close to all these public transport systems. But at the same time, Tree Lodge is also close to a lot of the town level facilities. And when I talk about town level facilities, these are facilities that are meant to cater to serve the entire residents in the entire town, right? So for example, these are some of the kind of town level facilities that are coming up. So there's a town hub. So that's a kind of like a major hub that serves the entire Pongo town. So it's supposed to have your community club, your public libraries, of course, lots of shops. Some of the government services would also be located there as well. At the same time, there's also this Pongo Regional Sports Center. Again, having a lot of these sports facilities located to serve the entire residents of Pongo town, right? We also have, Tree Lodge is also close to this recreational facilities and greenery called the Pongo Waterway as well. So if you see, there is this water, this kind of like a blue waterway that runs through Pongo, right? So Tree Lodge is again quite closely located near to these, right? So these are some of the town levels, but at the same time, also at the neighborhood level, they don't forget the neighborhood level. There will also, neighborhood levels will also have their own neighborhood centers, their own set of facilities and amenities. Could be schools, could be like a neighborhood park, as well as our own section of shops and eateries as well. And that flows down to the precinct level. And it's planned this way so that it's not only convenient for residents, but also, of course, reduces the need to travel as well. And through that, and if you do need to travel, of course, there's also easy access to public transport systems. So the idea is to kind of reduce carbon emissions in that sense as well. Right. Okay. The other aspect of Pongo is also, there's this new Pongo Digital District that's coming up. And that also has been designed to be eco-friendly. It's designed to reduce the need for private car transport. So it's going to be energy efficient, tap on renewable energy. So this is something also coming up at Pongo. Okay, right. And so I mentioned about public transport, having an integrated land use and public transport, the integrated land use and transport planning approach, right? So that also contributes to the greener commutes, right? So you don't need to have car transport. You can always tap onto the public transport. So again, within Pongo, it has a light rail transit system that serves residents within Pongo itself. But there's also the heavier MRT system that then links Pongo to the town center, the city center of Singapore, and of course, other parts of Singapore as well. Okay. So besides the public transport systems, there's also a lot of push for cycling as well. And the cycling network in Pongo itself has expanded quite a lot. It has actually quite a dense network of cycling paths in Pongo, right? So you see an example of that on the top right-hand corner. At the same time, also, they've actually in Tree Lodge and other precincts in Pongo, they've incorporated these bicycle racks as well at the bottom of the blocks, at the foot of the blocks. So that also allows the residents to actually a convenient place and safe place to kind of park their bicycles, right? So it's kind of like this, the basic infrastructure. Also, the cycling networks within Pongo itself. And it's not just cycling, but if you see in the top right-hand picture, there's actually also this sheltered linkways. So in Singapore, as with many countries in the tropics, the sun can be quite hot to walk around, quite hot and humid. So a lot of these sheltered linkways serve areas where human traffic is heavier. So it provides that shelter for people who are walking. So for example, from the MRT station or LRT stations to the nearby blocks. So these linkways will actually link these paths so to make it more convenient and actually more comfortable for residents to walk. So it encourages people to walk as well and take public transport and walk. So whether it's rain or shine, so it's more comfortable for the residents there. Okay, so this is actually my last slide. So kind of looking a little bit forward. So Tree Lodge and Pongo was really kind of like the first eco-town and eco-precinct that HDB developed. And from there, they actually kind of took some of those lessons. They some of these infrastructure they piloted at Tree Lodge and Pongo. They're actually going to also implement that in other new towns, other new estates, new development, public housing developments in Singapore. So in particular, things like your solar panels for greener energy and also reducing energy consumption. So you have the solar panels, you have things like your LED lighting. Rainwater harvesting is also another element that they've actually implemented in new public housing developments in Singapore. Also looking at how to retrofit that in existing public housing as well. And of course, greenery will continue to be a key part of our public housing developments in Singapore. And of course, finally, things like keeping our towns cool, whether it's from implementing kind of like some of these technologies in cooler paint, for example, right? So these are some of these, that's some of the kind of different elements of the HDB Green Towns program. And that really has the aim of also reducing energy usage, energy consumption in HDB towns by 15% by 2030. Okay. So I think that's my last slide. Yes, okay. So that's my last slide. I've kind of leave you with this image of how HDB plans to kind of incorporate some of the lessons learned from Tree Lodge and from Pongo in other public housing in Singapore.
Thank you, Jean.
Thank
Chair,
you.
very, very interesting. Yes, audience, would you like to have questions, if any? I mean, yes, I'm part. I'm quiet because of. I'm very impressed, and have a lot of questions and curiosities when listening to these very interesting presentations and informations and these the ecosystem of the livable cities in Singapore. So, but I will not ask the question now, but I would like to give to the floors of the participants to raise the questions to Jean first. I have many questions on behalf of the participant also.
Joe, this is Masood from Bangladesh.
Yes, Masood, please.
Yeah, so very interesting presentation, and we are all mesmerized. So seeing that this is slowly being implemented. So in our country, what we are seeing that the most of the big apartments that has been building by different housing company and private organizations. So they are taking this sort of initiative to build multi-story buildings. So my question is, the pictures that we have seen in the presentation, so those has been developed or implemented by the private organization or by the public organization. So, and what are the challenges they have faces? I know there are a lot of challenges, but they have already overcome. They have shown it here. But in short, what are the major challenges they have faced?
Okay. Right. So maybe just a quick answer to whether it was implemented by public or private sector. Is that what your first question, right?
Yes.
Right. So in the public housing towns, HDB takes the responsibility. So the Housing and Development Board is a public sector agency in Singapore. So it's part of the government. It takes the responsibility of planning, designing, and implementing the public housing development. So that is with that's driven by the public sector, but of course in terms of construction, actually implementation, installation of some of these systems, they would then partner with a private sector contractor to come in to help to actually install and implement as well, right? But in terms of design, planning, all that is pretty much that lies with the public sector, with the HDB. Yeah.
Yes. Right. I mean, that was also my question too, who did it and and where the money come from. I mean, so Jean, this public housing in Singapore is subsidized to the Singapore residents, or how the money comes in here, because we feel that it's a huge investment for the residents, and how much does it cost per unit, and does the resident has to pay, and is that competitive to the other type of housing? That perhaps my first question.
Yes. Yeah, so we do get asked that quite often as well. So how it works in Singapore is HDB sells these the residential units to buyers, right? So you do buy the housing on a 99-year lease.
All right.
At the same time, while they do sell the housing units, there are also various subsidies for Singaporeans. They also are mindful to keep pricing affordable. Like I mentioned, right? It's meant for 80% of the rest of Singaporeans here. So they're also very mindful to keep the housing affordable as well. Right. It does mean that there's a fair amount of subsidy of funding coming from the government as well. So for example, with HDB, every year they will have sort of like a shortfall. So while they sell, they actually earn revenue as well. That there will be quite often a shortfall that the government has to come in and top up. So there's an element of subsidy as well. So that's kind of it's also seen as part of course, like a social program for Singaporeans.
Yeah. Right. Right, and there is one question from the audience here, and so I mean, from our country, you know, these public housings may be coming from the resettlement schemes because we have to move the resident from somewhere else, which is maybe occupying the public land to the proper lands there. So, is there any such thing like that you are having the purpose of relocating the residents to the proper area so that you can also manage that area which belong to the public land, for example, or this is part of the service of the public, government.
Right. So which is why I kind of started my whole presentation to kind of give you an overview of public housing. I know it is quite a different context here compared to many other countries. Right. So I would say in the earlier years, I would say I'm talking about maybe 1960s, 70s, maybe even up to the 80s or so. There was the element of resettlement, right? So we actually had people who, in order to develop some of the areas, we kind of have to resettle some of the population. So when we resettle them, they were then quite often resettled into public housing like HDB flats. So that I would say that was maybe more in the earlier years of Singapore's history. Today, it's less so. In terms of the need to so-called resettle people and free up land. It still happens once in a while, but not in a large scale. Yeah.
Yeah, and the gentleman that put the question on the screen, Fakul, just have the same. So the maintenance cost. This is by resident, of course, but also the government also subsidize for the maintenance, and maintenance could be very high because we are using a kind of a green friendly technologies there, for example.
Right.
So will that be true?
Okay, maybe just to talk about Tree Lodge itself. So it was sort of like a pilot project for HDB. The upfront cost was a little higher compared to, say, the typical kind of public housing development. I think it was something about 5 to 8% higher, right? So at that time, it was kind of an upfront cost that the HDB, the public sector, absorbed as well, absorbed upfront, considering that it was a pilot project, right? So I would say the cost differential wasn't there was a bit of cost differential, but it wasn't that significant. So I think the idea was really at Tree Lodge was to not just incorporate some of these technologies, these green technologies, try out some of these technologies, but also at the same time, try to understand what kind of technologies, what kind of approach would actually be cost efficient at the same time. So it wasn't simply trying to pack it in with the most advanced technology. I'm sure there are a lot more fancy stuff out there, but it was really also mindful of how to keep it cost efficient so that the units at the end of the day, the housing units are still affordable. Yeah.
Yes, another questions that I believe that the audience will also benefit too from my side was there any a lot of discussions and talking among the public agency who are coming from different sectors, the solar cell sectors, the building sectors, the concrete sectors, the electricity sector, with regard to designing this complex, because of they are holding different rules and regulations, and this affect the time of designing and also the operations of the construction. I mean, how you get rid of that, kind of overlapping and conflicting because of the rule and regulations, and they are coming from different sectors.
Yes, right. I think it's a great question as well, because I think we quite often hear that coordination issue is quite a challenge in many other places, right?
Right.
I would say for the advantage of Singapore, I think it's that because HDB has been in business of building public housing for quite a few decades now, it's actually been quite a well-established way of working with the various agencies, right? So for example, I mentioned about integrating your land use plus your transport planning, right? And that's sometimes a challenge in other places as well, right? So when HDB plans, and HDB has the mandate to plan the town as a whole. So they take charge of the planning most of the town, where your residential units go, where do your facilities go, schools and etc. Right. Of course, also in consultation with the other agencies which look after this portfolio. So there's actually a very close coordination with our land transport agency that then looks at that actually develops the transport infrastructure. So even things like your linkways as well, right? So there has to be close coordination because the linkways are actually usually developed by our land transport agency to link from, say, a public transport, say the MRT station to your nearby amenities, right? That kind of sheltered linkway is actually built by LTA. So again, there has to be quite tight coordination. And because I think they have had quite a few years of experience going through and building these new towns throughout Singapore, there's actually quite a common understanding of how to go with. So your processes are in place as well. But yeah, I think if you look back maybe 50 years ago when Singapore first started, I think that quite often was a bit of a challenge, right? Getting that coordination going.
Yeah, very impressive. Very impressive. Okay, so we have two questions from Mr. Emmanuel and Tarun here. But why I'm saying very impressive, because it means that the board, the housing board, working very hard, and the board is not just the think tank, but also bridging the connection among different agencies, and they are working very hard. Yeah. I mean, it's not only the think tank, just think and then make plans, but, working also. Yeah. Very interesting.
So at the think tank level, we kind of suggest things, but the agencies have to implement. And while I've given you a very nice picture, I'm sure there are also challenges along the way. It's probably not always so smooth sailing.
Right. Yeah. Okay, Emmanuel, please.
Yes, thank you. I want to thank Madam Jiang Chai for this brilliant presentation. My worry is concerning infrastructure and sustainability, especially in urban areas. If we look at most cities or towns in the global south, that's the developing countries, the urban fabric is disastrous. So it's usually a huge challenge because most urban planners, they don't take into considerations like population growth. They don't consider other aspects. And just of recent in 2015, when we start looking at climate change and sustainability goals, and so many structure have been put in place. Even looking at energy management in building is still a huge challenge because the infrastructure, to change the whole infrastructure is a lot of money. So I wanted to know, like, from the experience from Singapore, how is Singapore coping with this mutation, like to transition from former ways of designing houses to make them more adaptable to our environment, energy reduction and all that. How do because also at the level, if we look at public housing, you transfer the responsibility to the government, and now that private ownership is not there, and most often the maintenance is not looked upon, especially if it is not something owned by you. So I wanted to know, because I believe we are also learning, and we are also maybe policy makers in the future. Like when we go back to our countries after our studies, we have to look up about these issues, how we can resolve this issue. So I really wanted to know from your experience how Singapore is being able to overcome these challenges, and what could you recommend for like countries or housing in global south, how to manage these issues.
Right. Thanks for the question, Emmanuel. I think that's all quite very pertinent, right? I think, to be honest, it's an expensive endeavor as well, right? First, we had to have the conviction that was public housing, and a mass public housing was something that the government will want to go into, and then have to set aside that financial resources, not just manpower, of course, having the right structures in place, and then of course the financial resources as well, right? So if you talk about incorporating some of these green features, whether energy efficient or even like your solar PV integration, right? It's of course, I would say, I would think it's often easier when you talk about sort of like a greenfield development. And therefore with HDB, it's really with the newer housing developments since Tree Lodge, they've actually taken those lessons learned, some of these infrastructure implemented and improved on them in the newer, when they went on to build new public housing developments, right? There's also, of course, the existing housing stock that we're talking about as well, right? And I mentioned at the start, there's like more than 1 million housing units in Singapore. A lot of it is already existing, of course, existing older housing stock. So HDB is also looking at how to then retrofit some of these. Not all the technologies could be retrofitted in a cost-effective manner, I would say, in existing housing stock. But they are piloting some of this. So for example, in terms of rainwater harvesting, they're looking at what's a better way of doing it. So instead of maybe putting it on rooftop, it's actually looking at it at the underground level. So where you are kind of draining stormwater from a few blocks at the same time and then storing it at an underground water storage. And that's probably a more cost-efficient manner to do it. So they're experimenting with some of these. I don't think they've all the answers. I think the retrofitting is retrofitting in existing estates is probably trickier. But with newer ones, I think they have a bit more room to look at refining and improving some of the technologies that they've first piloted in Tree Lodge. Talking about maintenance, maintenance is something that has actually been kind of decentralized to what we call the town councils in Singapore. So they provide some of this maintenance services. But if you're talking about kind of like rejuvenating estates, right? So HDB also plays a role in that as well, right? So again, then HDB comes in to, for example, kind of upgrade older housing blocks, right? And there's a co-sharing of expenses with the residents as well, right? But there's actually quite a bit of government funding that comes in for that. So through that, through some of these upgrading estate renewal programs, they kind of ensure that your housing stock doesn't deteriorate too significantly. So you kind of maintain your housing stock over the years as well. Because remember, I talked when we buy the housing units here, it's on a 99-year lease. So they do try to maintain the housing stock as well. Yeah. So I hope that gives you a sort of idea.
Thank you.
Hello, am I audible, sir?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for the nice presentation. But I have a question is that we are highly densely populated city or country. We build modernized and high rising building or a skyscraping building with as a demand of the time and for the accumulate the whole population. But is there any plan of Singapore government after the lifetime? Every product have a lifetime, like the building have the lifetime of 30 years to 50 years. After lifetime, the scrap of the building materials or waste of the building materials, how will be maintained or will be managed by the government? Is there any plan or policy?
All right. Thanks for the question, Tarun. If I could clarify, are you talking about the construction waste or?
Yes, this is the construction base. After 30 or 50 years, there's this building which we are prepared now. they become the scrap or the wastes due to their life cycle is completed. Then we think there is a great challenge will be face a good challenge to manage this waste of this building construction materials, this ultra modern building like solar panel. Definitely you know that the solar panel is one of the challenge of the society and the environment. And in considering the sustainable development, we faced a bigger challenge to manage these construction materials.
Okay.
Is there any policy of the Singapore government?
That's a question, Tarun.
Yes.
This is probably I can't really speak too much on this point. That's not really an area that I'm so familiar with. I do know that I think there is some requirement to recycle at least some of the construction waste if you can. So I guess maybe some of the steel and things like that where it can be recycled. There's actually, I think there's certain requirements for the construction companies to actually try to recycle things like that. In terms of your PV panels, that I'm actually not too sure whether there is a kind of like any regulation that requires these to be that mandates that these had to be recycled. I'm not too sure about that. But I think at this point, because like I mentioned, the solar panels, right? It's something that we've actually just embarked on not too long ago, right? And in fact, HDB is actually rolling out these solar PV on the rooftops across a lot more blocks actually. So I guess at this point, they're not really thinking about or rather they haven't really maybe mandated anything in terms of recycling it yet, because these are actually still fairly new projects, right? But I'm sure there are conversations about this, as you pointed out. It's also an issue as well.
Chin, do you know the design life of this tree lodge?
Design life?
Yes.
Okay, so our units where we buy, like I mentioned, is on a 99-year lease as well. So I don't know if they're referring to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just 100 years, right? Okay. Yeah, interesting. Tarun, you still raise your hand. Tarun, you have quick questions or? Okay. All right. All right. Thank you so much. We before we say goodbye to Chin, we can have a group photo, and then I will give a vote of thanks. So camera on and smile. And we smile with fantastic information, Chin Chia. We learn a lot. I mean, your presentations is encouraging me to get a ticket and fly to Singapore. And
yes, please do.
And spend time maybe today and tomorrow to visit this place, and the rest of the time shopping.
Yes,
and
yes.
fly back to Bangkok.
Yes,
and
welcome
thank you
to
so
Singapore.
much, and Tarun and colleagues. At the end of these sessions, I have the announcement that there is some event which is organized by UNEP from Singapore front. So that is an opportunity you will be able to explore further on how the infrastructures in Singapore has been doing there, so that I will keep that information after the session. So Chin, thanks a lot, and we hope to get connected and working with you on the knowledge transfers and capacity developments and sharing ideas. We see you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And
Bye-bye.
yes, visit Tree Lodge.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So next sessions we have to go back to Bangkok, and we have to go back to West in Bangkok. So this is the video presentation which we preserved it since yesterday. And the presentation of the video has been made by Mr. Ponprom, who is now working closely with the recent Bangkok governor on the waste management site in Bangkok. I don't know what is contained in that video. I mean, we surprised together, but let's see the final information with regard to what is the ideas of dealing with waste in Bangkok. Perhaps the idea which is coming from the video is something inside that the new governor of Bangkok is going to do in the next 4 years of his term. So that maybe is a good information. So enjoy the video of 20 minutes and then we come back to the final part of the webinar. So the video, please.
Good afternoon, Sawadee Krap. My name is Ponprom Vikisra and I work with the United Nations Environment Programme. And today I will be speaking to you about the issue of food waste and how technology to reduce. So note that today I will be focusing on the reduction and prevention stage, the beginning of the waste problem, rather than disposal or the downstream parts. A lot of attention has already been given to. So please allow me to share my screen. So in addition to working for the UN Environment Programme, I'm also a lecturer at Thammasat University, teaching on sustainable development as well as other international relations related topics. First of all, just allow me to briefly go through the food waste problem. It's very what we call a puzzling problem in terms of that one part of the world there's not enough food going around. There's food scarcity or food shortage. As you mentioned, FAO mentioned that there's currently 8.9% of global population, or as much as 700 million people that are going hungry worldwide. Additionally, UNICEF says that 22% of children under 5 are at risk of being stunted or having other health-related issues due to malnutrition. So that's one part of the world where there is food shortage. When we move to another part of the world where there's too much food and food becomes food waste. And that is a puzzling where one part is shortage, one part is excessive. So as the statement says, at the same time, the world has as much as 1,300 million tons of food waste, or 1 in 3 of all food produced become waste. So it's not really about food scarcity or food shortage anymore. It's about logistics. How do we match the two, or how do we encourage one part not to waste too much, and how do we encourage sustainable production, fairness in another part? So that's one of the key problems for the food waste issue. So actually, that's a global impact of food waste. You know, not only the waste that we see being thrown into landfills, and of course that affects climate change as well, you know, with methane emissions more potent than carbon dioxide, we all know. But in terms of food production, right? Food production uses 30% of the world's available agricultural land. That is a lot that is being allocated to produce food, which 1/3 of the food becomes waste. So a lot of the land is not used efficiently. Of course, there's big costs in terms of food production and production of food that actually end up going into landfills. And lastly, with food production, of course, it comes with high water consumption. So 24% of the fresh water used globally in agriculture are used for waste. So overall, it becomes, 1.3 billion tons, as I mentioned in the last slide. All of this contribute to carbon emissions around the world. So a figure here says that it produces 4.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. So that's 87% of global road transport emissions. So while a lot of the attention given in the sustainable sustainable world towards electric vehicles, ecosystem, how do we promote the shift from internal combustion engine to EVs? Actually, we also have another problem, not transport, but food waste that contribute to climate change, where more attention should also be paid to. So the diagram on the right kind of illustrates that actually there's so much land that is used to produce food that is never eaten and becomes waste. As you can see from the map, it's the entire United States of America, Mexico, and the lower part of Canada. So roughly 3.4 million square miles. So UNEP is responsible for the target 12.3, which the target is to cut in half per capacity global food waste at the retail and consumer level, and also reducing food losses along the production supply chains, including post-harvest by 2030. So in target 12.3, we kind of split between UNEP, where we looked at the food waste, which is we draw the line at the consumer level. So where retail sell it to households, hotels, HoReCa, and others. Food loss is more of an upstream part. So you consider since the farm. So sometimes there are overproduction at farms that becomes waste. So that's food loss. Loss during transportation part, so from farm into wholesale markets. So sometimes that could be food loss due to inadequate refrigeration system. That could be, apart from transport, that could also be in terms of food amendments that you packaging and all those things. So that all is considered food loss. So there are two different index. Firstly is the food loss index, where FAO kind of considers. We have to say that there's currently not that much information that could be contributed to the food loss index at the moment, because data collection is still difficult. As I mentioned, there's a long stage and different places where data could be collected. So still, there are some difficulties in terms of data collection. And in terms of food waste index, where UNEP is responsible for, is considered to be a little bit easier to get data collection. And one of the key outputs that UNEP have produced is the food waste index report. And the report also gives a comprehensive guidelines in terms of how to get the data in terms of the process of measurements. So there are various ways that one can measure food waste. In terms of, it could be due to diary. You can get a dedicated person to get a diary of what is being thrown away and wasted every day. There could be the waste composition analysis. So that's quite in depth in terms of you would have to separate the waste, and then you can track down, collect data on which type of waste, etc. So there are many other different methods that could be used for measurements. But the overall goal is to reduce food waste and food loss by 50% by the year 2030. So when we consider food waste, I want to emphasize that it's not only the food waste that we think about. That's of course the core part of the issue here, but there are other types of waste. So we like to call it waste in food supply chain. So what else in addition to food waste? Of course, there's pollution. We think about carbon emissions, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and PM 2.5. So these pollutions can be related to the food supply chain. So you think about transporting from farms that are far away in the rural areas into wholesale markets, which are typically in the outskirts of town, and from wholesale markets would go into retail markets in city centers as well. So between each point there are transportation, and if the transportation part is not sustainable, then actually it contributes a lot to emissions. And also from cooking, cooking in many parts of the world, charcoal still being used, and LPG gas, which all contribute to climate change as well. And of course, in addition to pollution, there is packaging. So you have plastics, styrofoam for ready-made foods, and pollution of microplastics. Of course, this issue has become even more prevalent in the COVID-19 pandemic period. Okay, we can skip, but this is just to show that we think, we have many countries who are considered largest emitters of greenhouse gas. But if we combine all the carbon emissions that is related to food waste globally, this, if considered to be a country, will be third largest emitters of greenhouse gas behind China and the US. So UNEP has done a lot of work in food waste reduction. We have done a lot in terms of communications. We have communication platform like Think, Eat, Save, where it's a one-stop shop for new ideas, news, and just innovation and sharing of campaigns and everything. There's also the introduction of Food Kit, where it's a toolkit for those who can come and who would want to get involved in the communication sides and raising awareness of this important issue. UNEP has also launched the Little Green Book, Little Book of Green Nudges. So nudge policy is in terms of behavioral change. How do we encourage people to shift their behavior? So easy examples in regarding to food waste are that in canteens one can remove trays, right? Because when you have trays at canteen, you are naturally getting a lot of plates and putting on the tray because you can carry at one time. But of course, if you don't have a tray, you can only carry a plate and a cup, and that reduces your food. Or gives options of so in canteens in Thailand, majority of the food involves rice, right? And sometimes they give you too much rice and you don't finish it and becomes waste. You can ask the vendors to give you small rice. There could be set portion, small portion, medium portion, large portion, according to your preference. So that would help to mitigate waste. And we also involved in stakeholder engagement as well, the campaign Champions 12.3. So UNEP works with a coalition of leaders in organizations that are committed to this goal. And lastly is the Emerging Coalition and Food is Never Waste. So it aims to support different countries, mostly developing countries, to measure their food waste baseline. So you coordinate with relevant governments and see how you can support in terms of data collection as well, and how they can develop a national plan to reduce food waste. Thailand currently is ongoing in terms of developing its own food waste plan as well. But I mentioned the food waste index with measurements guideline. Or the focus that I want to talk about briefly is the the project on the use of green tech and digital technologies to reduce food waste at consumer levels. So we explore into the different ways technology can be used, which I'll go through some examples. And we talk about the role of stakeholders in supporting this use. You know, stakeholders can come from public sector, private sector, civil society. So one of the interesting part is that at the beginning of the project, we did a survey to ask the people in Bangkok what they think about when they think about how technology can be applied to food waste. As you can see, the number one or the top answer is food waste management at households and restaurants. So what does that mean? It means that when they think about how we can use technology, they think about the downstream, right? So once you have food waste already from households, from restaurants, how do you get rid of it? How do you dispose it? So maybe they think about biogas technology. They think about compost machines, etc. But actually, there are other ways that are the use of technology for the more upstream part. Of course, number 3 is important, is collecting from donators and connecting the two. So in terms of that, hotels, if they have what we call food surplus, so it's not food waste, but food surplus can still be eaten, right? It's still perfectly edible. So think of buffets and you still have well-prepared food. You can pack it, hygiene, check with our hygiene, etc., and can donate it to you know, those in need of food in the poorer communities of the cities. So connecting the two requires technology and infrastructure as well. Storage and prolonged shelf life, the 5th answer, is interesting. So a lot of technology can be used for storage and for prolonging of shelf life as well. How we keep, say, fruits or food, extending their shelf life would definitely help with the food waste reduction part, because you think of supermarkets when you have fruit baskets, and at the end of the day, if no one buys, then it will have to be thrown away. Right, so if you have new technology for packaging, then maybe the fruits can be sold the next day, the day after, or even the week after as well. Management of inventory and stock as well. Sometimes restaurants, they buy too much food or raw materials because they are not sure of the demand that will come into their restaurants in the day or the week. So technology can be used to help them prepare so that they don't over purchase raw materials. And that also helps not only with the environmental side, but also the business side. So for technology, we divided into 3 parts. So green is more about thermal preservation, so things to do with refrigeration, and biological and biochemical preservation, so, you know, the use of oil and natural extracts for packaging. And the second one, we look at green and digital. So think of your smartphone apps, right? The apps can help you and with many of the tips and tools to help you reduce food waste. For example, apps can be used to track what is in your fridge at the moment. Sometimes you forget, right? It's natural that when you go to the supermarkets and you're unsure of how many eggs you have left. So sometimes you buy new ones and there are still old ones there. So you can keep track of what is in your fridge through your app. Or, you know, there are some innovative apps where they provide menus from the leftover raw materials, that ingredients that you have. So once you have all the ingredients from leftover, and then you can fill it into the app and it will come up with menus where it will allow you to cook using specifically those leftover ingredients. Very interesting as well. And the last one is the green, digital, and IoT. So we think of smart packaging, the use of sensors and barcodes, etc. So it can track, let's say, the transportation part. cartons and cartons of fruits and boxes. You can have sort of sensors to track its colors, its its smell or its shape, etc. To understand how the process of transportation. Just a few examples. The APU is some sort of high-tech sticker where it can help prolong shelf life, extend shelf life. Oleo to the right is where once you have leftover ingredients, you can share it onto the platform, and your neighbors can buy, or you can share with your next door neighbor. So say you bought too much onion for your food, and then you want, instead of throwing it away, you want to share with your neighbors, etc. Time strip in the bottom left is, as I mentioned, the sensors where it can track here, with the delivery of fresh strawberries, etc. So that falls to part of IoT as well. And the bottom right is interesting. It's called Wasteless. I think it's a startup in Israel where it's called dynamic pricing, in terms of the price falling, or falling as the food has long been in the stand. So the longer the fruit or the salad has been on the shelf, the price goes down and down and down, and once it becomes and hopefully someone picks it up at cheap price before it becomes expired. So use of AI enables the price to change automatically. In Thailand, we also have very good examples. So on the left is Yindi, where they use technology. It's an application where they deal with, let's say, hotels or restaurants that have food surplus, and then they can put it on the platform where consumers can come in and purchase at a cheap price. To the very far right is SOS, where also they deal with food surplus, but this will be in terms of donation towards the poorer communities. They work with big businesses, retails, and big hotels as well. And in the middle, light blue is a consulting firm in Thailand where they work with restaurants and to see how restaurants can become the most efficient that they can be, as I mentioned, in terms of ingredients management, stock management, etc. And this, just to talk about how this will be at the end, the downstream parts, where food waste is being recycled, in terms of for compost, for biofertilizer. A lot of that's being done quite a lot in Thailand. EM water can be used to help with sewage, etc., and also can be used for biogas as well, production of electricity that can be powered back at your markets, or etc., making it a closed loop, a circular system. And lastly, it's very important that there's a coalition of partners that can help to support the how technology can be used. So firstly, the government, in charge of public policy and regulations, you can think of governments helping to do with sticks and carrots as well. So if you think of like stick, then you think of, let's say, the French government, where they ban food waste. So that's quite a stringent option in terms of that. For supermarkets, if they have food waste, they have to send it to their own compost campaigns, or else they get fined if they have food waste. So that's more of a stick part. But for carrot, it could be in terms of pay as you throw incentive. So the more you waste, the more you have to pay. So that becomes it incentivizes restaurants, etc., to reduce their waste. So they pay less for waste collection and waste disposal. The use of tax and fees mentioned. The private sector can very much get involved in voluntary agreements, so CSR campaigns and those according to ESG guidelines. A lot in Thailand, a lot of big companies, retailers have been very proactive in terms of promoting this issue, installation of big compost machines, or donating to organizations or NGO, social enterprise like SOS that I mentioned. Information, nudging, and standards are very important. The grassroots initiative are very important in terms of information provided. They can help with data collection according to the UNEP Food Waste Index, how to measure accordingly, because at the end of the day, information is key. It's difficult to find the best solution for food waste if you don't know where the food waste comes from, what type of food waste, is it liquid, solid, vegetable. If you have that information, governments can plan how to effectively manage this issue. So information becomes very important, and of course grassroots initiatives can help. And lastly, the global and regional partnerships is very important in terms of that. Best case study can be shared from around the world. Which country are doing well in terms of food waste reduction? If France is doing well because of the strict laws that has been applied, or other countries. And it can be shared with developing countries where they're just starting. So this brief presentation was just to highlight to you that technology is very important. It has a lot of potential, and not only technology will be used for the downstream or disposal like biogas or compost. Technology and the focus should be on the upstream as well, where it can prevent food waste from happening, because it will put less of a burden on the midstream, on the downstream end. So if we focus on upstream, then we sustainably manage the value chain from the beginning. So, and of course, efforts must be combined between different stakeholders, government, private, all those things. So hopefully this brief presentation will give you some information about this issue. And if you have any questions, please feel free to share with me, and I will try to get all the information back to you as soon as possible. Thank you so much. Sawasdee krap.
Very nice presentation, right? So if you have any questions, send your question in the chat box. Don't record your question through your video. You don't need to do that, all right? So you can text your questions in the chat box, and then we can collect questions. And when Mr. Pon Prom is less busy with his today work with the Bangkok City Corporation, then we tried to find a way to talk to him. And if need be, we can also invite him to have a session with us one day when he is less busy. Now we are approaching the end of the very interactive session. But before I'm coming to that part, do you have any concerns or questions? Just questions among us, or any things that you would like to share before I'm sharing the outputs from our brainstorming sessions, just to show you so that we can see how we are going to, take the next step from there. At least we have a base to start from. So any concern, any questions, anything before I show my slide, and then I will also show some news, and I will have announcement at the end, and then we will close these trainings and web dialogues. While I'm waiting for the question, if any, I am going to also arrange my presentations This will be very short presentation, by the way. You are very tired, I know, and we are on Sunday, not Sunday, not Sunday, sorry, it's Friday mode. So, and we are very kind of full of information. So I will try to make it very short, but very attractive. So my dear audience, this is what I have tried to help you to digest in the past 3 days. And I will share this raw material with you so that you can keep it. I have the raw material from every groups, and I also have the raw materials that I already have a bit of think it over for yourself, and I can share that. All right. Now, before I share this, I just want to flip this for you to review quickly. If you would like to add any more things after we have a good digestion from day 1 to day 4 today. I mean, especially the 3 sessions just a while ago were giving a very good information. So we might have to add that into our previous thoughts and anything like that. So I would like to read quickly of the policy issues in terms of the policy and regulatory issues that we are going to give as the initial information for us to move to the next step of thoughts. All right. So the policy issue in terms of the regulations, that number 1, we have to consider the holistic approach and also the multi-sectoral connectivity or nexus approach in doing the circular economy, knowing that this cannot work in one sector alone. All right. So whoever we have to consider, we have to have that advocacy to have the consideration of the nexus approach. All right. Number 2, we would promote the circular economy as a tool to implement the sustainable consumption. So there were a lot of connectivities and connections and discussion with Dr. Shabir, Professor Shabir yesterday, and also linked to sustainable consumptions. And we know that, the CE2 can be served as a tool to reach to the point of the, responsible consumption, sustainable consumption, no waste, less waste, and produce with using waste, and also keeping less waste, all right, as well. So, try to neutralize everything. So that is the number 2. Number 3 is to strengthen the appropriate technological innovations to materialize the circular economy from labs to the real world. So that is the ideas that we would like to have now. This is the time to cultivate the real practice into the field so that we can really launch the circular economy practice into the real situation so that we can have a very solid evidence that something moving forward. And these things will not be only from the laboratory point of view, but also from the, participations, engagements, and a reality that can be used in the future. So that is first test of the things that we absorb. Number 4, we would explore the way to create the comprehensive formula to determine the financial and economics espresso on the circular economy. And we have discussed a lot in terms of feasibilities and also viability of the resources, whether it's worth the money to invest, whether it makes sense to business to invest, whether it makes sense to have a private sector to attract them to come to this investment. So we worry about how we should have the way to make a right calculation so that we can make decision on the monetary part of the circular economy. The 5th is to increase the CE practice site to raise awareness. So I think this is one of the things that the group has been raised and also discussed. We would like to raise awareness so that the people can witness the realities and pragmatic of the implementation of the circular economy. Number 6 is to promote inclusive regulatory framework. So this inclusive regulatory framework is very okay, so I come back. My Wi-Fi was, yes. The 6 is the inclusive or a kind of inclusive regulatory framework, which is different agencies should share what are the common area of regulation that they should build upon, so that we can have. Now I will share my screen again. Okay, there. All right. Okay. So you see my screen now, okay? And number 7, engage the national and subnational political representatives. Some group I remember mentioned about the political commitment, political knowing on the politicians person. So that is one thing that we also would like to share, that how I would say the representatives of the society would also embrace or take this idea forward. That is another thing. Number 8, to develop. Okay. Oh, you are moving, right? Okay. Number 8, to develop a knowledge transfer programs for awareness and capacity on the circular economy, giving the importance of key stakeholders. So this is very obvious. We discussed a lot on the day 3 and day 2 and day 3. And even I also inform you that in this program, we also trying to do a kind of conceptualizations of the Excellence Center for Circular Economy. That may be the entry point that we can also promote the CE in our region, in our countries. And number 9, to introduce the appropriate technologies to strengthen the CE in priority sector. So now we are doing a lot of the waste sector. We may be doing a lot of tourism sectors, maybe doing a lot on the the renewable energy sectors. What else that we can expand to other sector, like maybe construction, like we are hearing today? This could be more on the maybe power sector, or maybe other industrial sector. So this is a thing that we would like to keep in mind. And if colleagues here in the Zoom would like to add anything, you can raise now, or maybe after I share this one, you can send me your version by sending this one to my email, which is appear at the bottom of my, my screen here, so that you can share your thoughts. So I would also add that up. So we will have more collective ideas to make it make sense there. Now we move to quickly to the capacity points that we're looking at, and this one we are looking at the technical skill. We should have technical skill in terms of the 3 R's, and perhaps we have to have more skill on more R's, right? We have reuse, recycle, and also reduce. But what about remanufacturing and also refurbishing, redesigning, so on and so forth? So what else that we can add value to the circular economy thinking? Life cycle, of course, very important. How we are going to strengthen that, and also get with the help of the academicians, how we are going to say eco-design is another one that we hear from UNIDO, that they have practiced this in the economic zone, special zone. How we are going to promote this eco-design in, so example, we just see from Chin that, this eco-design can be also used in the public resident compound as well. So that is the thing that we can think about. I also recall the thing that we are exploring on the solid waste, inter construction waste. Can we do really anything about that? Because we have concern in Thailand, we have concern in Bangladesh, and many other countries, because this of the abolishing construction waste. Number 1.4 is on the compliance, and this is something we discuss a lot. At the end of the day, the company and the industry should have the agent to have the guidelines and SOPs, something like ISO, so on and so forth, that we have to comply from, and that might be something that we can work on. That can also create a new career for us. Who knows, in the future we need the CE auditor, we may need the CE assessor, we may need also the CE, a chain agent in the company, in organization, like we used to have environmental audits, we used to have the EIA assessor before. So it's maybe the same that we have been practicing in the past. Number two big point is that the technological innovations and approach techniques. So how to be innovative. All right. What else that we have to be consider when we are going to do a product innovations? Is that design thinking is the way out? Is that VUCA is the way out? Is that, scenario planning is the way out? Is that only the human resource centers design is the way out? Is that weak signal from the market is the way out? So there are many empirical studies that we can also take it. Just during the COVID, there were a lot of studies and new theory coming in. So what else that we can think about in order to support the innovation and product innovation? Now we are also working on one of the knowledge body, which is related to the weak signal. The customer may not say it very loudly, but what are the something that the customer do not say, but that may be very important for the innovation. So how can we use this weak signal theory to use for the product innovation, for example? So actually, our team here is now working on that, and we are trying to look at the knowledge bodies, how the weak signals approach can be also used to the product innovation, for example. So something very interesting. If you like to join, we will have some news very soon. Number three, business partnership, how to increase the business skill, to have the communities and enterprises and so on and so forth to join. And we take notes of the suggestion of the youth groups as one of the very important starter of the CE concepts in our society, so that we properly record that. Number four, approach to mobilize financial resources and expertise. We know by lecture by Dr. Ria yesterday that there are opportunity open from ADB, from World Bank, from GIZ, from OECD, and so on and so forth. So how these financial resources can be mobilized in order to fine-tune the interest of the funding agencies, and also to fine-tune the interest of our organization and society in order to have money to invest in, because now the risk is very high, we know. So we need to have some guarantee of the technical capacities and also the resource capacity, as well as the funding capacity. Number five is also marketabilities of the CE product and so on and so forth. We know that, this is something new. So we are looking at the demand size of the products. Also, we are talking about how the, waste processing generation that Dr. Pineda presented yesterday, how would be is marketable in the municipalities that they are willing to, take that technologies and also to move on in reducing waste. And we are hoping that also will, kind of minimize the occupation of the landfill sites in the society, because we know that the landfill site is also having a lot of impact and also take a lot of money. Number six is digital device and also the social media things can be used for promotion, as Kun Pon just raised a while ago, that this supply chain promotion through digital media is very important. Number seven is on the organization functional that we discussed on day two with relation to the functional organizations, how we are going to engage with practice and stakeholders engagement over there. And number eight on circular economy leadership. So this is, I believe that UNEP is doing something on this one. And also UNEP is going to launch one program in Singapore next month. I'm not correct. If I'm not mistaken, I'm not wrong. I think next month I will have that information at the end about the leadership program for CE in infrastructure to announce to you. And number nine is they develop the trainers, and everyone here, in this Zoom and anybody here can become trainers on different parts of their specialization, and I believe and AIT would be able to help you to become a chain agent by transfer knowledge or the CE for trainers. So everybody here, welcome to be part of pool of trainers on CE in various sub sectors. Last but not the least, in the financial incentivization, we were discussing about the encouraged business partnership. We are talking about the competitiveness, adding values, and so on and so forth. We are looking into the guidelines for practice, green economy, green procurement. And also number 4, we are talking about the provide opportunity for recognition of best practice so that the market alert and also the public knows, and then this, the circular economy product can be part of the mass production where, the marketabilities and also in the market sphere that they can have a free competitions and the price is going down. Number 5 is also mentioned by one group yesterday. I remember, I appreciate that this topic is coming up. Number 5, please remember EPR is going to be our next policy dialogue in August. And so you stay tuned. We will give you information on this one. We will talk about the plastic pollution, plastic waste management by using the EPR approach. All right. And number 6, finance resource, not research, financial research and development by private sector and the industry to support by the government and community. Let me clear what is number 6 really. I think I have a typing error, but anyway, it's a kind of a financial resources that we can, it's a cost sharing modality that we can have there. So these are the things that I keep as a key takeaways. And this is in the final versions. I will distribute for sure for every one of you. And after you get it, please send your feedback on this to me directly. You can see my email up there in my screen, and then you can send back to me so that we can incorporate that into the papers, and we are going to prepare this finalize as the stock taking exercise. Any questions? So if not, allow me to go to the announcement, which is given by Sheng Sheng. You will see in the chat box now Narumon is already placing the evaluation form, and this evaluation form is very important for us to look to ourselves how we prepare this program, and also your feedback will be very important for the next events and for the next activities. So you can see that at the bottom part of your evaluation form, we also request you to have your full names, so that we can have your full name in the certificates. All right. So please have your full name into the evaluation form so that we can take that names into the certificate. So please fill in the evaluation forms and submit to us as soon as possible so that we can process it. And by that time, we can also process the certificate from AIT to every one of you. And then we will send the certificate to you by various means. Okay, it can be hard copy, it can be electronic copy, it can be electronic but plus hard copy. Never mind, we can do everything. All right, so that is something. But please do importantly, we need your maximum number of the questionnaires to be answered, and that will be very kind of you. Okay. Now my next information, which is from Sheng Sheng, that asked me to give this information to you. Let me find that information. So many information. Oh my God. All right, so this is the news. It doesn't appear. Bear with me. Okay, expand that. Desktop. save, and then wait. Okay, so I can show this. All right. Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Stop sharing. All right. Yes, I get it. So now you can see. So the next event, which is organized by UNEP, and also Cheng Cheng also involved in this one. You can see on the top of this, 25 days from now, you will have a virtual format event on the Environmental Leadership Program for Sustainable Infrastructures. It's jointly organized by Singapore Cooperation Program and the UNEP and the Singapore Environmental Joint Training Program with the Civil Service College of Singapore. All right, so we have full details of this information, and Cheng Cheng will share with us with the information that we can also give you so that you can. It's not moving. All right, so the information on the screen that you can see now, I don't know why it's not moving. The dates of this dialogue, virtual dialogue, web dialogue is from 4 to 8 July. Okay, 4 to 8 July. It's supposed to be in that information, so that on the screen, but I cannot move. So the file is already shared in your box, in your chat box. All right. Okay, so please do not forget to do the evaluations. And my last part of the information before we close, the last part that I would like to say is to thanks every one of you, my dear audience, that you stick with us for 4 days. We are so delighted and we are so honored that we have you with us here in this event. This event would not be very successful if we don't have you in front of us, from day 1 to day 4. And we are so proud of the inputs that you have been given to us, because this is a very useful raw material, which is we would like to pack it for you and give it away to you so that we can think it further for the next step. And believe me, this would lead to another concrete events that we can also have a kind of thinking further, whether it's a next step, next webinars, and also activities that we would do. Okay, so we are very grateful to have you here. You are really champions. Your ideas are great. So wherever you are, we thank you. Big thanks to everyone. From our side, I would like to convey my thanks to our colleagues in AIT, which is contribute a lot to this, webinars. And we have been working this for long, weeks to get this webinar. The speakers, the UNEP speakers, the senior of the UNEPs and colleagues are coming for the presenters are very helpful and they are very, very kind to us. We have people that I want to mention, Dr. Naveed, supporting us, Dr. Chris supporting us, Cheng Cheng, needless to say, always, giving us opportunities, Ponchanok, Narumons, Dr. Memons, Dr. Mustak, giving us this opportunity. So we are so much thankful to them, and I would like you to give a big hands to everybody. This event will not be very successful, if we don't have people at the back of the studio. So here, if you come to me now, you will see these people surrounding me and they are my bosses. I'm not only having one boss. A lot of boss, control me now. So we have Kanya, we have Prinya, we have Komsan, we have Nitikan. Nitikan is also my cosmetics persons, and also could Chok to help us to do this. So we thanks to them, and I would like to request your big hands to them. And this team are great teams, and we would like to work again with this team for the next events. And big thanks to all of you. I would like to close this 4 days training with UNEP and AIT, and we are promising you that anything that related to circular infrastructure, we will let you know. And we would like to have you in this community of learning. Thank you so much, everyone. And until we see you again, goodbye for now.